Now, my observation is that people have a small God. You know that book, Your God is Too Small. And it's true. Most people have a small God, about the size of their own imagination, or even a little bit smaller than that. And just as people have a small God, they also have a small Christ. A domestic Christ, a plastic Christ, a Christ that they want to mold to their own preferences and whom they limit. And when we talk about discipleship, my observation is that people have a focus in their discipleship. And there's some aspect of Christ that they like to think about and they like to major on. And they relate their discipleship to that particular aspect of Christ that they major on. Now, none of these things are wrong, of course. The problem is simply that they're only part of the story. So when we talk about discipleship, a lot of people think about the imitation of Christ. What does it mean to imitate Christ, the Christ who was amongst us and whom we follow, who is the model for our way of living? And of course, that is a very important aspect of discipleship, but it's not the whole story. Or other people, it's the death of Christ. They see his work in terms of his dying upon the cross and shedding his blood to cleanse us from sin. And again, that is absolutely true, and we will look at it again as we go through. But it's not the whole story. Sometimes people talk about a vampire Christology. What they mean by that is all they want from Jesus is his blood to cleanse them from their sin. Or for other people, it's the ascended Christ, the Christ who is now on high, and therefore they live in victory all the time. They begin their day by leaping out of bed and saying, another day of victory is before us. And they try to live their entire Christian life on this level of exaltation, triumph in every circumstance, the expectation of the impossible immediately. It sounds pretty exhausting to me, I have to say. I've never quite been able to sustain that level of enthusiasm. And yet it's true, of course it's true, but it's only part of the story. If we're going to be true disciples who have a knowledge of the Son of God, then we have to have the whole Christ, not just a partial Christ. A Christ who fills all things, as it says here. The Christ who fills all things. The Christ who is greater than you and I can think or imagine. And that's what I hope we might explore. And then work out the implications for the way in which we live our lives. By the way, some of what I say today is in this very fine book, which is available from all good retailers, especially Manna, and it's called Jesus Christ, the Alpha and the Omega, 40 daily readings for last Lent. And this sold very well, actually. I'm very pleased by the way it's sold. The subtitle, Jesus Christ, the Alpha and the Omega. He is the beginning and the end. You know, Alpha is the first letter in the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter in the Greek alphabet. And in Revelation 22:13, it speaks of Jesus Christ, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And it uses exactly the same language of the Father, of God the Father. It describes Christ with the very same language with which it describes the Father from whom he has come. So let's begin by thinking about the Pre Existent Christ. Now, you're going to learn a few words today that you may not have heard before, and I give them to you free. They are so you can impress your friends when you go from this place. The Pre Existent Christ, the Christ who existed in heaven with the Father from the beginning of eternity. Well, eternity has no beginning. But in eternity itself, before ever he was known to us by the name Jesus of Nazareth, before he was made incarnate he already was and had been from eternity with the Father. If you don't believe me, John chapter 1 is the important passage here. And there are several important passages which tell us this, but John chapter 1 is perhaps the most clear. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. Christ was pre-existent. He existed with the Father from the beginning, sharing the Father's nature as God. He was God, it says. He was with God in the beginning. And this is crucial for us because it determines the way in which we relate to Jesus in worship. It tells us that Christ is eternal, and eternity is a property or a characteristic of God. Only God is eternal. Only God is everlasting. We were singing about everlasting God. Only God is everlasting. And yet Christ was with him. As long as the Father has been, Christ has been. He shares the eternity of God. And it's on that basis that we acknowledge Jesus Christ as one who is worthy of worship. It would be wrong to worship Christ were he not eternal, were he not truly God. We would be engaged in an act of idolatry, worshipping that which is created rather than that which is uncreated, if we did not acknowledge the eternity of Jesus Christ. He was in the beginning. He was part of the origin of all things. And I love these words about all things came into being through him. Have you ever met any Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way? Did they come to your door? And they knock on your door? I mean, bless them. They're lovely people, in my experience. Crucial question that any Christian should ask a Jehovah's Witness is, do you worship Christ? Because that's the crucial issue. Because for a Jehovah's Witness, Christ is not God. Christ is an angel who became human, but is less than God, and therefore not to be worshipped as God. And that's the existential attitude with which discipleship begins. Bowing the knee to Jesus and acknowledging that he is higher than I am, and that he is worthy of worship. And actually that's what distinguishes us from many people of our generation. Because it's characteristic of many people, not all people, many people in our day and age, that they don't want to bow the knee to anybody. Who are you to tell me what to do? Who are you to say this or say that? I am in charge of my own life. I am sovereign within my own life, myself, my body, my life. And I bow the knee to nobody. Well, we say we do bow the knee to the one who is eternal, because he is worthy. And it's right and appropriate that we bow the knee to the one from whom we have come and on whom we depend. Because that too is what it's telling us. It's in him was life. The life was the light of all people. All things were made through him. You see, the perfect answer to the Jehovah's Witnesses, you've got to follow this carefully, folks. And remember, this is Spurgeon's College. You have to think when you come here. It's not enough just to feel things. You've got to think about the things that you feel. Think about this. It says, all things were made through him, and without him not one thing came into being. Now, the Jehovah's Witness says that Jesus Christ is a created being. God made Christ as the first of all creatures, and then made other creatures. But how can he be a created being when it says, without him not one thing came into being? How can he be the means whereby he created himself? He must have existed from the beginning to be the agent of creation, to be the uncreated one, the eternal one, in whom all things exist. When you realize that all things were made through him, and his light is the light of all, you begin to see Christ everywhere. In everything. Not just in church on a Sunday. In fact, sometimes that's the place I find Christ least. Not at Lewin, of course. I go to some churches and I struggle to find Christ there. But I find him everywhere else. In the very fabric of creation, because it was made through him. And therefore, for me, there's a depth to creation which those who know not Christ cannot see. One of those old hymns that we used to sing, I can never quite remember the words, and I'm embarrassed to admit it, really, because these days there are certain things we're not supposed to sing. I mean, the only old hymns we're supposed to sing are "Crowned with Many Crowns" and "To God Be the Glory," and the rest are a little bit old hat, aren't they, in our imagination? I'm speaking with my tongue in my cheek, you understand at this point. But there's a lovely hymn, and you have to remind me of the words, but it goes something like, heaven above is deeper blue, earth beneath is richer green. Anybody know this one? Something shines in every hue, Christless eyes have never seen. You see the added depth. And I've tried being an atheist. I've tried very hard to be an atheist. It lasts about 20 minutes. Because for me, there's an added depth to everything I see, which comes from believing and knowing that Christ is the one through whom all things have been made. So I hope, sisters and brothers, being a disciple for us at Lewin means being profoundly human, being deeply human, not being ashamed of our humanity, not afraid to acknowledge that we are mortal, frail flesh, acknowledging that this life that God has given is a good life, whatever ways in which human beings have spoilt it, whatever ways we too may have spoiled the lives God has given to us, to be given the gift of life, to be allowed to live, to be part of planet Earth is a good thing and something that we should celebrate. Why? Because Christ is the one through whom all things have come into being. Christ is the one who gives us life, and life to everything that exists.